Hello, you are listening to the Witch on Wine podcast, and I'm your host, Yolanda Shoshana. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am so excited about our guest today. She is an internationally known author, journalist, and essayist, and she has written for the wine correspondent for Wall Street Journal magazine and Time and lots of other places. But she has this fabulous new book called For the Love of Wine, My Odyssey Through the World's Most Ancient Wine Culture. Welcome to the show, Alice Feiring. Hi, Alice.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my God, my pleasure. I really love your book, and you educated me a lot. So, I always love to ask people, how did you get into the world of wine?
I got into the world of wine nose first, and it all started to form when I went to graduate school up in Boston, and my roommate had a wine collection, and she was trying to get into the wine business, and there were wine tastings at our apartment twice a week. And after a couple of years, I knew something about wine. I didn't mean to. I just meant to drink. But it was unavoidable. And I continued these wine tastings through the decade I was up there. And then around 1988, I decided that I just had to go back to my original love of writing and try to make a go out of it. And when I moved back to New York, because I couldn't imagine writing any other place in the world, or at least in the States, I started writing about, pitching stories about something that I felt like I had something to say about, and wine was one of the topics. Then the world has a way of deciding you belong into this little box or that box, and I got put into the 100% wine box. And so I never, ever set out to be a wine writer, but that's how I got to wine.
Great journey. So your new book, For the Love of Wine, explores wines from Georgia, which is not necessarily the most common topic. So why is it we need to know more about this region, and why do we know so little about this region?
Yeah, well, first of all, whenever I start talking about Georgia, I have to say not the place that Atlanta lives in, and it is, by the Black Sea underneath the Caucasus, bordered by Turkey and Azerbaijan, and so it is, I think, why do we know so little about it? Well, for 70 very important years, it was under Soviet rule, and a lot of people still refer to it as the Republic of Georgia, but it has been that way since 1990. So, they got out of this under the rule of Soviet Union in 1990, and then they had a good 16 years of trouble. And terrible poverty, and trying to, deal with who was going to successfully rule the little country and where it was going to go. And it took really until 2003 for these people who are the longest, the oldest continuous wine culture that we have. There may be others that started making wine around the same time, but Georgia's winemaking was just continuous through, 6,000 to 8,000 years, how you do the counting. And in it is their soul, and you have all these people whose family never stopped making wine, and they were just anxious as hell to go and, for the first time in modernity, actually make a living as a winemaker. During Soviet Union, they could only make wine for themselves, for their family, or if they worked for the state.
Wow.
And so there was really, it's a really new ancient wine culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Cool.
And the story is so fascinating that, of course, I think that everybody needs to know about it.
Absolutely. I agree. Do you remember the first time you tasted wine from Georgia? Do you remember where you were and what you were doing? Were you in Georgia or were you in New York?
I was in Sonoma.
Ah, okay.
And it was in 2008, and my book, The Battle for Wine and Love, had just come out, and I was up there doing an event, and there was a dinner party for me, and a friend of mine brought a bottle of Kisi, which is one of the, and Georgia has 525 indigenous grapes, and it was one of them, but not exactly easiest to pronounce one, but not exactly a household name. And it was made in these berried amphora that they call quevri, and I was just immediately charmed. It was very low acid, but there was something very, I don't know, ancient about it. Just there's something very soul-stirring about the wine, and of course, it's difficult to find. Even back then, it was difficult to find wines from Georgia. That year, there was a wine tasting here in New York about wines from Georgia, and I went in expecting to taste fabulous stuff, and I walked out totally disgusted.
Oh no!
And it was Cabernet and Merlot, and I'm like, what happened to the 525 different kind of grapes that they've got there? And what about making wine in the traditional way? And I really thought, okay, this is another story of post-Soviet Union country who goes out and they want to make wine just like everybody else.
Yeah, but you cover that
quickly turned around a few years later.
I'm glad you cover that in your book as well. So as you mentioned, so the wineries in Georgia, they don't necessarily use barrels. They use the quevri. Can you explain more about that? Because I'm sure a lot of people don't even know what that is. And you're saying that other winemakers from other countries are starting to embrace making wine that way.
Absolutely. Making wine in clay is very hot right now. So this was probably the original vessel used. No, I'm positive it was, other than a cow's skin, it was probably the original vessel made, which is done, which had been done. But as a vessel, it was the original one, and it makes perfect sense. And what they did, they could be various sizes, from reach and clean to jump in and clean sizes, or various number of people jumping in. They can be huge, and they're buried. This allows for the most simple way of winemaking possible. You put the grapes in, you let them ferment there. It's one-stop shopping. And you forget about it. Basically, the way they usually do it is, so after fermentation, they just cover it up and open it up like 6 months later. And what they started doing is they make white wine. They make white wine like a red wine. So they leave a white wine on the skins and the stems and the seeds for all of that time. So the white wine becomes very tannic, and the red wine is usually much more ethereal because it's pressed off quickly. This is done, the benefit of this is that since the traditional winemakers are making wine very naturally, so no yeast, no additives, and no sulfur, the skins act like as an antioxidant, and they're almost like in the book I call it like a sunscreen for the grapes. It really protects it from the ravages of oxygen and keeps it from turning into vinegar. Burying it in the ground gives it instant temperature control and usually protection from earthquakes and all sorts of disasters. So once you get in the ground, you can really use one of these things for centuries, unlike wood.
That sounds so interesting. Wow.
And you had asked me whether there's a taste from it.
Yeah, does it change the taste? Clearly, I'm sure it does. How could it not?
Well, it does only in the way that, actually wood probably changes the taste a lot more. It's a pretty neutral. If you're keeping your quevri very clean, it should be as neutral as concrete. Sometimes you feel you can taste. People say I can taste the quevri, but what they're usually tasting is the skins packed on the grape.
Gotcha.
On the wine. So really, it doesn't. It's a pretty cool. It
sounds like it. Wow. And so Georgia, in your book, you mentioned that Georgia is more known for its white wine versus its red wine. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is, just because it's, it really is, of the past couple of years, we've been hearing a lot about orange wine, and which is this wonderful amber-colored, and that is probably the way all the ancients made their wine, and this is the way of Georgia's tradition that's going on. And it is very interesting when you go through the number of grapes. They do have a lot more white grapes than they do red.
Wow.
I actually never really figured out exactly why that is.
I mean, the way you describe the white wine, it sounds so sexy and delicious. I'm like, I got to get my hands on some of that.
But you have to be prepared that they're not really fruit forward. So it's really this whole other dimension of savory or lemon balm.
Wow.
It's slightly honeyed and rose water, and a little bit nutty as well. And they are, you drink usually throughout the whole meal, no matter, with a variety of different tastes at the table, and they're very food friendly.
Gosh, it sounds so good. But the way you describe things is very beautiful. I love your writing. So you mentioned the connection between religion and wine in Georgia, which definitely intrigues me because I'm not sure if you know, I'm a clairvoyant as well, and I really believe in wine and spiritual, and it has this meaning. Could you explain more about that? Because I love that chapter in your book.
Oh, thanks. It's a very, very intriguing connection. I've never been to any country where wine is more knit into people's soul. And they often, and actually being really tied to religion, like the way I got to Georgia for the first time, I was invited to an international Quivery conference, and it was hosted by the Oliverdi Monastery, which to me sounded like some sort of setup for the next Borat film. And just like these, monks going around with their wine. It just seemed very crazy, but it wasn't crazy. It was very impassioned, and they really almost view it as their service to God to make wine naturally. So not just to make wine, which of course you do it in devotion to God, since the woman who brought Christianity to the country came carrying a grapevine cross that was plated with her hair. And so Saint Nino is a big saint. It's a very, very deeply religious country. And it was just, there was one time at the Quivery conference, there was a scientist who got up and was talking about the danger of making wine with native yeast and additives that he felt was really necessary. And there was this one older man wearing traditional Georgian garb stood up, and he was quaking with anger about it. And he was just, are you telling me that God didn't give the grape what it needed to make wine without this kind of science? And it was as if the suggestion that he might use anything to adulterate his wine was so against his deep conviction as a Georgian Orthodox Christian that I was just, now this is interesting. I cannot imagine this going on in any other culture.
No.
Of course, wine is used sacramentally for centuries, but nowhere is it viewed to be as something that should be made as purely as what is viewed to be a Holy Spirit. And I found that whole aspect to be completely moving. There you go.
Wow.
I think that's probably a really good analogy.
Yeah, wow.
Saint Nino is, as I said, is deeply revered. The church is very involved in reviving the ancient tradition of making wine. And
sounds amazing. Oh my
I know.
gosh. What an experience.
I was brought up as an Orthodox Jew, and I can't imagine that ever going on in yeshiva. So.
No. Over the Manischewitz.
Right.
So what I also loved about your book is you have all these great recipes. I was like, oh my gosh, I want to make this, I want to make this. So in case somebody is ready to unleash their inner Martha Stewart or Rachel Ray, or they don't really know how to cook, like which recipe do you think they should start with? Because It might scare a few people off, but a lot of good ones.
It might. I think that probably the easiest recipe is the mazzoni soup.
Okay.
Well, actually, the easiest one is probably Nino's delicious fritters, but that's not the most traditional Jordan, and that's like any sort of. Is actually really delicious and really simple. The fritters.
Wow.
The mazzoni soup will definitely be, which is a yogurt soup. It's just so soothing. It just feels so good to take this in. Is probably the easiest, and so I would definitely go with that.
Okay, cool.
And it's very traditional, and you definitely try to get as sour yogurt as you possibly can.
Okay.
And and then the other one that is my favorite recipe is the Western Georgian beans, the lobio. I adore that recipe. The trouble with that is that it calls for some ingredients that are hard to find, and they're spices. So one of them is dried marigold flowers, and the other one is blue fenugreek. It will still be delicious if you leave them out.
Okay, cool.
You could use a little bit of saffron. You could use a little bit of turmeric to add instead of the marigold flowers. And the fenugreek, I really don't know. But as long as you just really use some beautiful fresh tarragon and mint, it's going to be good.
Okay. Sounds good. Sounds perfect for this time of year, too, right before it's about to get real warm. And I love that rose jam recipe. I'm totally going to try that.
The thing about that rose jam, you really need untreated roses.
I know, which will be hard to find, but I will find them. I'm going to find them. Yeah.
It's not impossible. It is not impossible. And you have to get the petal right at the right moment.
I know.
This about Georgia is also seasonal. It's like just get basically you have to make it in June just before the roses unfurl. You know, there's the black walnut, the pickled walnuts, the walnuts drop right around summer solstice. What is so fabulous about Georgia, we talk about seasonal eating, but
they do it.
It's a religion there. And actually, as a clairvoyant and as a healer, I'm wondering what you thought about the sections about Lamara and her ancient healing. And she was I have two sections in the book about Lamara, and she has kept the traditions of healing through ancient recipes alive, and she was one of the most amazing individuals I had met. And I'd be very curious for you to go back and take a look at some of her remedies in the chapters.
I will. I'm like, now, I mean, I have to say, when I was reading your book, what I did love is I felt that soul coming out. I was like, wow, these people really are getting it. They feel this to their core. And for me, that's what wine is for me. And I like closing my eyes and sipping wine and letting it go through my body so I can smell it, taste it, and just have an experience. And that's what they're doing. That's what George is all about. That's why I was so excited to read your book.
You certainly got it then. You certainly
Yeah.
Makes me happy.
I was really excited. I'm so glad that I got it in my hands. So now, though, we've probably gotten people excited about wine from Georgia. How do we find this wine? Where do we find it? What do we do?
Where do we find it? What do we do? Well, okay. Go to winesearcher.com and try to find something in your neighborhood and look for the wines that are available. The people that sell wine that are available in this country are Pheasant's Tears will be the largest producer.
Okay. And
I'm talking of natural wines that no additives and just very much the kind of wine that I write about. Pheasant's Tears. Look for Iago's wine, IAGO, Iago's wine. Those might be what else? Okro, OKRO, and then what's the other one? Is it Ogro? OGRO. Or maybe if you just go to winesearcher.com and search Georgia. In the New York area, I'm more familiar where you can get them. There's wine merchants out in Brooklyn.
Okay.
I know that 67 Wine and Spirits Astor wines.
They have everything.
Chambers Street wines, Frankly wines. You can experience them by the glass at Amphora, which is a great wine bar in the West Village.
Mm.
There's a Red Compass is a new wine bar on Orchard Street.
Wow.
So it is possible.
Okay.
And more are coming.
Cool. So if you come to New York, those are the bars you should check. But also, if you do live in another state, most of these places that she mentioned, I'm sure, ship to other states. So you can go online and order this stuff. That's what's great now about
Exactly. You can go
ordering
online and order from Thirst. Thirst probably has the best selection. Check in a few months, Chambers Street as well. Oh, and if you're lucky enough to live in the Bay Area out in California, there is a new wine bar there called Punchdown that has, I think, 3 by the glass.
Oh, cool. Awesome.
So check it out.
Cool. So you have this great newsletter. You do normally write about natural, organic, biodynamic wines. So you have a newsletter, though, people can sign up and get, right, no matter where they live. So perfect. So how do they find your website, and then they can find your newsletter? What's your...
Go to my website, Alice Feiring, Feiring. So it's alicefeiring.com/newsletter, or just go Alice Winewriter website. I'm easy to find. And it's a subscription-only newsletter, and there's a lot of free stuff up on the blog. But, I get into some pretty technical stuff and specific wine recommendations, which are, as you said, only organic, biodynamic, and natural.
Yeah, that is so cool, and I love that. And, of course, your book, For the Love of Wine, I'm sure it's available, on Amazon and all the other platforms. Of course.
All the usual places, yes.
Yes. I thank you so much for your time and your book and, all your wonderful wine writings. You inspire me, and I'm sure will inspire so many more who are just finding out about you. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And until next time, cheers to your magical life. Bye.